to our exclusive webinar, Beyond Provisioning, Navigating Information Management Challenges. I'm Jagjit Singh, Chairman of Informed Consult, and I'm delighted to have you join us today. Our webinar is packed with valuable insights and strategies for mastering information management and governance automation within Microsoft 365. We have two distinguished speakers with us, Richard Jeffrey Cook, who's Head of Information Records Management at Informed Consult. Richard will share his expertise on implementing information governance frameworks, creating effective information architectures, and managing governance, risk, and compliance. Then we're joined by Peter Baddeley, Director of Sales and Delivery at ProvisionPoint. Peter has extensive experience with the Microsoft platform, focusing on SharePoint, Dynamics 365, and Microsoft 365. He will be discussing automating information architectures in SharePoint, lifecycle policies for workspace management, and mitigating workspace risks. Peter will also conduct a live demonstration showcasing how ProvisionPoint solutions can enable governance automation in Microsoft 365. Throughout the webinar, we'll explore strategies to optimize your information management processes, ensure compliance, and drive organizational efficiencies. We encourage all attendees to put their questions in the chat during the webinar. We will address them in our Q&A session at the end, where you can engage with our experts and get your questions answered. Thanks again for joining us, and let's get started. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Jag, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Richard Jeffrey Cook, Head of Information and Records Management in Informed Consult. I've been an information management practitioner for 25 years now, which just makes me feel old, I'm afraid. But through that time, I've had experience working for a wide variety of organisations, helping to implement effective information management solutions. And that essentially is what we at Informed Consult are all about, helping businesses to get value from their information, addressing the challenges that information management involves. So today's topic, I'm looking at how to achieve more effective information management and focusing on the benefits of having a consistent and effective information governance framework. So what we're looking at with an information governance framework is actually a sort of strategic process to control the organizational information. And that involves having various elements, the roles, policies, procedures and processes in place to ensure that information is managed effectively throughout the entire life cycle, and ensuring that we're covering information really from the point at which it is captured and created, through its use, storage for reference, and then its eventual disposal at the end of the life cycle, and trying to ensure that we have the appropriate controls and controls in place throughout that entire life cycle. So the key element, I suppose, for an information governance framework, I would argue, is the information architecture. So that is actually the structure which controls how the information is going to be managed and processed. And at the heart of the information architecture is an appropriate business classification scheme, which is just a fancy word basically for a mechanism for categorizing our information. And categorization is really at the heart of controlling the information consistently across the organization. And there are 5 fundamental reasons why we want to categorize our information. The first is that it allows us to organize our storage. So through our categorization, we can actually decide how we're going to structure and store information. With physical information, that used to be absolutely essential because you had to have a filing system where the information was actually placed. With these days, electronically, technically, there are other mechanisms for storing information, but it's still at the heart of most information management storage systems. The second thing it allows us to do is apply context to our information. A single piece of information on its own gives limited value. It's the context in which that information sits and related information that provides the value that can generate better benefits for the business. Categorization also allows us to support browsing for information. People talk a lot about searching, but actually the ability to browse information is equally critical, because sometimes we may not know what exact information we're looking for when we start searching for it. And if you don't have those exact details, searching by itself is very limited. Fourth, it allows us to apply security policies. And the final reason is it allows us to apply our retention and disposal policies. And the two sit hand in hand. Retention to ensure we're keeping the information when we need to keep it. Disposal to get rid of that information that we no longer need. Partly because we may be required to do so for legislative purposes, particularly data protection, but partly unwanted information that may no longer be accurate or up to date is purely a drag on the business. And these days, far too many businesses have far too much information that actually is offering nothing but using up their storage and obscuring them from getting to the information that they really require. And with things like artificial intelligence coming along, the more redundant and inaccurate information you store, the more those tools are going to pick up that information and obscure you from getting the value that you need from artificial intelligence. Along with the whole business of categorization is the idea of having metadata. That's information about our documents and data stores, so that they can support our application of policies and also support searching, because despite what I said about browsing, searching is still a vital element to managing it and retrieving information effectively. So along with that, what else do we need? Well, first of all, we need an information asset register and to manage our information assets effectively. If we don't know what we've got, we can't possibly manage it effectively. So information asset management is very crucial, because it also allows us to turn our logical structure of how we would like to categorize and apply our policies and our retention, be those security or retention disposal policies, but actually apply them to our physical systems. Most organizations have a multitude of IT systems within which their information is stored, and we need to actually have, although we might have a policy which says keep this for 7 years, how are we actually, what's the trigger? How are we actually going to apply that to the physical system? We need to transform our logical, what we'd like to happen, into actual physical rules and practices that can be followed. So information asset management plays another critical part in our framework. Along with that, we have to actually make sure these systems are capable of being used. And one of the biggest challenges, and I think what makes information management so interesting, is actually how to create an effective user experience. Staff use their own business terms. They want to work with information in a way that makes sense to them. So we can't just impose our structure, our categories, and our terminology onto the way that they would like to work most effectively. We have to adapt our systems to fit in with the needs of the users. We also have to ensure that the users are trained effectively in how to manage information. Most staff are not information managers and have no wish to be information managers. So we have to come up with methods of managing information which actually are as seamless and invisible to our users as we can possibly achieve them. And this whole idea of not interfering with the job. So we don't want to put obstacles in the way of getting on and doing the tasks that they need to do. Because if we have those obstacles, then quite frankly, they're going to try and find ways around those obstacles, which might involve doing things that we do not wish as information managers for them to do. So it's a challenge about making information.
I think we might have lost Richard for a minute. We'll just give him a second to rejoin. Otherwise, I'll jump to my slides in a second. So please just bear with us for a minute.
Did you want to do that, Peter?
Yeah, I'll lead with my slides, and then Richard actually only had one more slide to complete, so we'll let him complete his slides towards the end. So I'll pick up the webinar from here. So let me just continue sharing the slides, and then I'll that's all. There we go. So I guess to introduce myself, I'm Peter. As Jag introduced me, I'm Director of Sales and Delivery here at ProvisionPoint. ProvisionPoint was founded in 2016. We're entirely focused on provisioning lifecycle and compliance for Microsoft 365, which makes up ultimately how we help organizations manage governance for Microsoft 365. We focus on Teams, SharePoint sites, Microsoft 365 groups, Planner plans, and Viva Engage communities. We automate a lot of what Richard was talking about earlier. So we automate how information architecture is applied. We can automate governance rules, and we can also help with auditing what has actually been deployed. So as I say, to give you a few examples, which I'll go through shortly in a demo. So we can automate things like information architecture. That can be structure of document libraries, folders, content types within that structure. It can also be channels and private and shared channels within Microsoft Teams. And we can also ensure that content is correctly labeled. So one of the challenges with applying things like retention labels and sensitivity labels to your content is you're often reliant on users making decisions, users having to consciously go and label information. Instead, what we can do is actually, as part of how sites are created within your organization, we can not only implement that structure, but we can also ensure that appropriate repositories automatically are labeled, and therefore your correct policies are applied to ensure organizational compliance for how data is secured and also how data is retained. In terms of ProvisionPoint, we also support various policies, and these can also help you with existing SharePoint environments and Teams environments you have. So the first element of that is lifecycle policies. So they help with expiring content. So Richard talked about expiring files, retaining files. disposing of files, ProvisionPoint can take that a stage higher and actually look at the sites and teams themselves and manage expiry processes around those. It's absolutely right that organizations have lots and lots of content, too much content and stuff which needs to be disposed of. And so our policies can work through a multi-stage retention and disposal of those workspace objects, so sites and teams. And I'll show you that shortly. And then we can also have further policies which check for risks, areas where you're not meeting the rules which you've put in place. So that can be to understand, are there sites and teams which aren't being used anymore? No one's accessing them, no one's modifying them. Maybe we'll automate the archiving of those. Also, other common risks which come up with SharePoint, often referred to as orphan sites. So sites without any active owners. If someone's not there to manage the content effectively, control who has access, then there's that risk of sprawl continuing. Other things like if you allow external parties to come and collaborate with you, then you might want to have policies to identify those which are no longer active in your system and remove them automatically. So ProvisionPoint helps with that automation. So I'll jump into a demo and show you a few of those key things. So firstly, I'm going to show you the process to request a new site or team or other workspace type within ProvisionPoint. I'm going to start with an end user. So one of the challenges with Microsoft 365 is thinking about the process around how sites and teams are created. You can think that let end users create them, and they'll often create them with no information architecture and just store content in a very unstructured way. Alternatively, you could drive that through IT, but then that not only takes time to set up, but actually can overload IT with requests, and they don't have time to set those structures up and information architecture up properly. So ProvisionPoint sits as an alternative to that. It's available as an app within Microsoft 365. I can access it via my app launcher. I also have it available in Microsoft Teams as well. There's different roles, so I'm in an end user role at the moment, and I can come in and I can request new sites, groups or teams, Viva and Engage communities from templates. And those templates can have the pre-built information architecture which Richard described. They can include things like naming policies, structures of lists and libraries, permissions, and they can also have policies to control what happens after they've been created, which is what I'll look at the second part of my demo today. So here I'm going to go and request a new team. Let's say I'm creating it for managing our HR policies. I can control how that workspace is secured automatically. I can lock down these controls, so some of them might be changeable, others might not be. So this is for sensitive internal information. I can't share it externally. I might be able to select from certain types of data sensitivity, which will then control how the workspace is shared and secured, but it might not be all of my different labels available in my organization. Again, aligned to the type of data which I'm going to be storing in this site or team. So we're introducing more controls. Richard also mentioned metadata. So I can capture additional information at the very point the site is created. Why this is useful is we can use it firstly to control the name going to be assigned to my site or team. So in this case, it's going to use the department code as a prefix. We can also use it to assign things like column properties for our metadata, which gets provisioned to our site. So ensuring that data is correctly tagged the moment it goes into the site. We can also use it for reporting purposes to understand and categorize our different sites and teams which have been created. This metadata is entirely configurable, so you can define which columns of data you collect, and it's often aligned to the information architecture which you're implementing in SharePoint. We can also ask for owners and members at this point. We can put minimum number of owners requirements. So if I try and request it here, it will warn me that I need to provide a second owner. So I'm going to do that now. This is really useful again for that risk associated with orphaned workspaces. If people leave the organization and the site or team ownership isn't reassigned, then it could mean that someone's not managing it correctly. Finally, we're applying one of our policies here. So this is a lease. This is going to control the expiry and disposal of the actual site itself. So I'm going to go ahead and request this site. And we can see that my request here is pending approval. So for any of these requests for new sites within our environment, we can implement and include an approval process. To show you that, I'm just going to switch browsers here, and I've switched to another user called Megan. So she's one of the approvers in my environment, and she receives an approval notification. So ProvisionPoint comes with its own workflow engine where you can allocate tasks to named individuals, groups of users, or even the manager of the user who initiated a specific request. And then she'll also be assigned a task here within ProvisionPoint to approve that request. So she can review the request, see how it's going to be created and the metadata, and then she can go and approve that request. And we can have multiple stages of approval to manage the process of creating the site, or in this case, a team as well. If I actually have a look at a couple of these templates which we've got configured, you'll start to understand how we can start to apply some of the information architecture which I've described. So for example, here I've got this one which creates a team. So we can define what it is which gets created. Is it a team? Is it a group? Is it a site? And we can include things like what default channels are included, so default structures in teams. What default lists are included as well. And that can vary per template. So if I look at this specific template for a site, you see here that we're creating a site collection instead. In this case, I can't configure channels because it's just a SharePoint site, but I can configure lists for milestones and reports. I can also define how that site or team is secured, external sharing settings, guest access settings if it's a group connected workspace. We can define what sensitivity labels are deployed to the site, and also the document libraries. Same for retention labels, so we can deploy default retention labels to those document libraries as well. So pre-configured, pre-set up the way you want it, both initially and also moving forwards in your environment. And I mentioned about naming conventions. So in this case, the code which I supplied is going to be set as a prefix to the name. All of these properties are configurable, and what columns are used and what names are applied. Let's, before we continue with the policies element, look at some of the other settings which we can look at what the results looks like. So let's switch back to our user Adele, and we can actually see both of our workspaces have been created. There's our HR site, our HR team with a naming convention and the name the user provide. And I also created this one a few minutes before the webinar for finance. So let's have a look at each of those in turn. So firstly, I'll go to Teams and we'll have a look at the structure within Teams. And then I'll have a little look at my SharePoint site so we can see how that's configured as well. I'll tell you what, we'll do the SharePoint site first because Teams is often the case is being a little bit slow to load. So here I've got a SharePoint site which I created via a request. And you can see here that I've got a setup, predefined a template. I've got a configured homepage with links and web parts. I've got a link to my hub site. So as part of our information architecture, we can commonly organize sites associated to hub sites. We can automatically link sites to the correct hub sites. And then I've configured a number of lists and libraries. I've got my milestones list. I've got a document library with some predefined folders. And one thing I wanted to show you here is if I go in here and maybe I create a new document. Let's say we're creating a technical spec here. And if I revert back to SharePoint, you'll notice that the code here is being pushed through from my provision request. So from ProvisionPoint, I can actually see that I've applied a specific project code and set that accordingly. Other things which I can do here is include different document libraries. So I've got a document library for reports. That includes some predefined content types. Those are synchronized from my content type hub. And I've also configured things like sensitivity labels, and retention labels on these libraries as well. Let's just give that a little refresh while we're continuing. So I can configure and define different labels, permissions, structures within my site as part of the provisioning process. I'll give Teams a second to load. There we go. And then exactly the same principle if you're using Teams as well. So you can come into a team which has been created, and let's take one of the ones which I've created earlier. And I know here it is, the one for HR policies. You can see the naming convention applied to that team. You can see the structure of channels which I've included for standard and shared channels. We can also provision defined apps as well as part of the process. So that's the sort of provisioning with relationship to information architecture. I just wanted to use the last couple of minutes of my demo to talk about policies which we can apply. So actually, let's just show you from the end user perspective first. So we can see that there's an expiry associated with this specific workspace, this specific site. It's going to expire in 90 days, and we can actually go and view the stages it's going to follow: when it's created, when it's going to be archived, and then 30 days later it's going to be deleted. We can configure that as a policy to help us manage sprawl and dispose of content appropriately. So associated with my template is a policy. This can be applied to your new and existing sites and teams. And the policy can be made up of multiple stages. So you see this one has a default length of 90 days. It's going to be archived at the point of expiry, and 30 days later it's going to be deleted. An end user or an owner specifically can request that that is extended for a longer period of time. They'll be notified before that expiry event happens based on rules you configure. And from the directory itself, they'll be able to come in and action an extension. That can also have approval. The second way which you can manage expiry is also based on usage. So for example, if your sites and teams are not being used, that can also trigger an expiry event, or just notify administrators of sites and teams which aren't being actively used. And I mentioned other types of policies which we can check. So for example, we can check for orphaned workspaces, so those workspaces without active owners, where there are incorrect names applied, incorrect security settings, or even things like inactive guests, again, based on a filterable criteria which we define. So I can notify, I can control behavior based on these. I can also deliver various reports to administrators. One of the ones which I really like is the policy check area. So here I can go and view the different checks which are run on my sites and teams, and I can immediately see any which are non-compliant. They're highlighted in grey. I can also filter on these columns. So for example, here I can go and see that this particular site is not being used and hasn't been used since April. So I might want to trigger an archiving event based on that. And there are other ones here. So for example, this one, it's allocated and shared to anyone in the organization. That's outside of the compliance rules which I've defined. So that flags as a non-compliance to me. That's pretty much everything which I wanted to cover in the brief demo today. ProvisionPoint covers many other settings around sites, teams, and groups. But what I showed you today was about how we can use these templates to create new sites and teams, how we can apply some of the information architecture which we've talked about in this webinar so far, how we can implement expiry processes to actually dispose of sites and teams which are no longer being used, making sure that users have access to the most relevant and recent and up-to-date content. And then compliance policies can ensure that your teams actually meet the rules you need to ensure are correct, that you've got active owners to manage it, that sites and teams aren't shared with external parties, especially if they contain confidential or personal information, and that ultimately this aligns with the information architecture and the governance rules which you put in place.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Peter. Unfortunately, Richard hasn't been able to join us, so I'll pick that up from there. If there is any questions, oh, Richard, you're back.
I am with you again. Many apologies. Many apologies to everyone. I've no idea why my Teams connection chose to drop out, but I hope, and thank you to Peter for taking over. Rather unexpectedly, I suspect. Yeah. So I think at this stage we are, if you have any questions on what we've presented, then please feel free to add them into the chat. Fortunately, I was able to rejoin while Peter was giving his demonstration. One of the things I'm always interested in is, Peter, what have you found when users actually start to adopt ProvisionPoint? What's the thing that surprises them or the benefit they find most unexpected?
I think one of the things which you find the most is organizations with an existing estate of sites and teams. They've already deployed and rolled out SharePoint and Teams, but they're looking for ProvisionPoint to help improve the governance. One of the first things people see is the directory, and it actually shows them sites and teams which they are the owner of. And that is really important because a lot of people have just forgotten about things which they've created and things they're responsible for. So it immediately naturally helps organizations start to clean up their environment just by giving them that visibility.
Okay, we still haven't had any questions, so please, if you do have any burning questions, feel free to add them to the chat.
I'll ask a question to you, Richard, while we're waiting, which is about, you talked a lot about information architecture and applying information architecture. Obviously, a lot of the clients, which I'm sure you talk to and I talk to, already have SharePoint and Teams rolled out. They might have already created a number of sites and teams. How can they deploy an effective information architecture on top of that?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things to say is that always with information governance, you're playing catch up. Nobody creates an organization and says the first thing we have to do is create our information management system. So being in a situation where you're trying to improve an existing situation, which is far from ideal, is perfectly common and normal. And I think it has to be a case of working step by step based upon the resources that you have available to improve things, and not trying to do a drastic all-in-one change, but work in small steps to improve the situation. And that starts, as I was saying, with knowing what you've got, and then being clear on what you're trying to achieve, and focus priorities to improve things gradually. So that would be my advice for any organization. Don't try to do things with a magic big bang, but make small step improvements and measure what you're doing, I suppose, is the other message that goes with that. If you can't measure what your improvements, you're going to have a really difficult job in actually convincing senior management to invest more. So identify a method of measuring the improvements that you're making.
I guess that really then influences user adoption as well, because for something like this, you've got to get users engaged. And I know, I'm sure as well as you know, some of these topics are a little bit outside users' knowledge areas. They sometimes might come across as a bit restrictive. And so getting users engaged, I think, is one of the key things to making this successful.
Absolutely. I think if users cannot see benefit to themselves as well as benefit to the organization, then these systems won't get adopted. And I don't think anybody particularly enjoys working with information systems that aren't delivering. It just creates frustration. Not being able to find the information you need is frustrating for anybody. So it's a case of actually, rather than seeing the sort of governance and rules as an imposition, it's actually demonstrate how improved processes will actually make their lives easier as well. So, and that's what we're all trying to achieve. So we have had a question come in. Do you think user education should come before setting up systems? Is that a better way to engage people who hold the purse strings? Peter, have you got any views on that particular question before I jump in? Because it's one of I'm quite happy to jump in on.
I certainly, if I think about the breadth of customers who have deployed ProvisionPoint specifically, so I'm just talking about from that technology perspective, the biggest task actually is working out what and how you're going to use it. And I think that then the biggest element is actually engaging users to do it. And I think getting your user community on board as early as possible and educating them, especially around this set of terminology and what you're trying to achieve, is the most important thing to make it successful.
Yes, so certainly my view is that education has to run in parallel with setting up systems. I think you need some education at the start because particularly when you're initially selling the idea of a change to a system, if there isn't some education and engagement, then the change is always going to struggle. But I think there's also the ongoing challenges as systems.
Oh, we've lost Richard again.
We've lost him again.
Critical moment.
I'll just pick up on that, Peter. So, yeah, what we see with most our engagements, and their enterprise engagements running for a year or two in terms of realizing these solutions, i.e. the investment that clients have made in the Microsoft stack and how to utilize that automation, that technology to deliver that information architecture. So as Richard mentioned, having that function activity transaction, the rules, and then also the people element all coming together in an information architecture that's then automated by the technology. There is a need for training up front. Training, I guess, more sharing the art of the possible. And what we've tended to do is to bring various stakeholders, IT, legal, sometimes individuals who are responsible from a corporate side, but more importantly also the information and team leads around the table and sharing and running through a workshop, providing training for a day or two, and also opening up a solution that we've got in our sandpit area to support the training and awareness, and therefore which in itself helps with getting the support and buy-in with the senior management, greases the wheels in terms of moving forward in a structured way with your eyes open in terms of what's involved in these programs of work. So that's the initial piece of training, and then there's training alongside as you're moving forward with the program of work, supporting the various stakeholders, the various function areas, and supporting the change that needs to be incorporated in order to ensure 100% user uptake. And that's I guess when we talk about training, that's the approach to training that we tend to take.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I guess the only thing I would add is also training doesn't end when the project's finished. The ongoing training, you have new members of the team join you, new processes which you need to implement, changes which Microsoft bring along as well, which you all have to incorporate. Systems are only successful if you continue to support and educate your users.
Yeah, and so absolutely, that's the material, the content that's produced as part of these programs of work leaves the client in a position where they have the supporting content to do exactly that. New starters through to internal changes that may take place, refresh in terms of knowledge, so they have that material to support them going forward, and obviously leaning on us as a delivery service provider. One of the questions I had, Peter, also was in terms of retrospective provisioning. So we've got some sizable council clients who, like many other organisations who during the pandemic had to roll out teams and so forth at various sites, and there's been a need to catch up, do some retrospective cleaning up, bringing structures through and so forth. How does ProvisionPoint lend itself to that?
Yeah, that's a real good question. And actually, we've slowly seen a shift that probably 70–80% of the people coming to us now and working with us now are in that latter category, rather than people coming completely fresh. And ProvisionPoint really helps in 3 ways around that, or 2 core ways. The first one is what's called actions. So I showed you the process of creating a new site or team. Actions allow you to implement a change, and that change could be additional structures, permissions, or other forms of settings which you want to apply. You can either apply those individually, or they can be applied on bulk. So you can bulk apply those across an environment. Or, again, following that templating model, so you can say we want to apply these changes to this group of sites. And then the second way is with the policies which I demonstrated to you. So helping organizations tidy up environments as well, identifying unused areas of the environment, areas which potentially represent a risk. So it can work in both of those scenarios for existing clients or existing heavily adopters of SharePoint and Teams, as well as new ones.
No, thanks for that. And another question, with organizations that have deployed ProvisionPoint, what's the thing that surprised them the most that they didn't expect?
I think it's probably, I'm not necessarily going to help myself here with this answer, but I think it's the time to fully adopt the product. So I think, like, the advice we give to a lot of our clients is don't try and deploy everything all at once. And I'm sure you're the same, is that actually you need to do it in stages. So define an area where you want to focus on. It might be SharePoint sites, it might be Teams, it might be even a subset of SharePoint sites as well that you want to focus on, and you want to implement that area successfully. And I think clients will realize that the success of an implementation will take time. It will take, especially for larger organizations, where they've got tens of thousands of users, potentially hundreds of thousands of sites, that can take years to fully adopt and deliver all the different components, because it just takes time to implement that level of change within an organization. And ProvisionPoint is also an evolving product, so new features will come along. So it's a constant need to develop and grow and utilize a product. So I don't know if that answer helped me, but I think what surprises some people is, I think some people perhaps go in a little naively thinking you can just turn on a product and it will immediately start working. But actually you need to bring and implement it over stages of time.
No, thank you very much. I see there's no other questions there. Is there anything else, Peter, you wanted to
I think the only extra thing which I would add is that we do offer free trials of ProvisionPoint. So if you want to actually get hands-on with the product and see how it might be able to help and support your requirements around delivering an information architecture or helping you to manage sprawl, then we do offer free trials.
Yes, thank you. Well, once again, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Richard. And thank you, everyone, for joining us on this webinar. I hope it was useful. And feel free to reach out to us. Happy to share insights. We're very passionate about the subject matter, as you gather, and share details in terms of how other clients may have approached this. And feel free to keep in touch. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you. Bye.